Hello, and welcome back to the Faith and Ecology podcast, an initiative of the Jesuits for Climate Justice, Faith in Action at COP30 campaign. I am your host, Daniela, and on today's second episode, we will be discussing the role of faith-based organizations in climate negotiations. Today, we have a superb lineup of guests. Let me introduce you to our first guest, Azmaira Alibhai. She serves as the Faith and Ecosystems Coordinator for the United Nations Environment Programme's Faith for Earth Coalition. Azmaira is dedicated to mobilizing faith actors globally, leveraging her expertise in interreligious and intercultural dialogue to strengthen institutional capacities and amplify civil society engagement in environmental sustainability at all levels. Thank you so much for joining us today, Azmaira. In your experience, what do faith communities contribute to global environmental negotiation spaces and policy advocacy?
Thank you, Daniela. It's my pleasure to be here. Faith groups, faith organizations, leaders, and networks offer this moral and ethical framing, adding to the conversation values-based arguments emphasizing justice, stewardship, care for creation, and intergenerational responsibility. And this is in addition to the technical, humanitarian, or economic terms that they've already been working with. Faith organizations emphasize on balancing the climate narrative. And we saw this at the first Faith Pavilion at the UNFCCC's COP that the Faith for Earth Coalition was instrumental in facilitating. The Faith Pavilion at COP20 was a place for faith organizations to lift up concrete contributions or the grassroots evidence that they bring to this conversation. In this space, they went beyond advocacy, demonstrating how they are offering technical support, working on solutions that place people and planet at the forefront through sustainable energy solutions, scalable agroecology projects, and other resilient food solutions, and so much more. There is mobilization and legitimacy, where religious institutions often command large followings, grassroots networks, institutional networks that cross geographic boundaries and have the trust of communities. And this advocacy can bring political legitimacy and amplify public pressure on negotiations and governments to act more ambitiously. And last but not least, faith organizations, institutions, and leaders have always provided this long-term vision, a horizon that can push negotiators to look beyond immediate compromises. So we weren't just looking at advocacy-based outcomes, but how can we come together as a group at this global level and leverage on each other's campaigns? And this is where faith groups urged negotiators to act with conviction.
What are some more of those successful examples from faith-based initiatives that are addressing climate change and environmental justice that you think form a very big part of the road towards COP30?
Right. I'll start with the Faith for Earth Coalition, an organization that I've had the pleasure to work with for the last 5 years now. What the coalition has demonstrated is its ability to bridge divides, fostering dialogue. We have been able to convene organizations, leaders, networks, and communities that cut national, cultural, and political boundaries. And their presence in this negotiation space has helped us to build bridges with other civil society groups like the youth, like the women, and the formally recognized major groups and stakeholders. It's this humanization of negotiations, the dialogue process, and putting behind faces and communities that are affected by the climate crisis that has been so instrumental in mobilizing the network. This convening power of the Faith for Earth Coalition is in many ways a standard that we need to continue seeing. Another really great example is the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative that has mobilized faith communities at a very local level to protect tropical forests in Brazil, Colombia, DRC, Indonesia, and Peru. I'll narrow down on an example of the World Council of Churches that has pioneered fossil fuel divestment amongst faith communities, advocating for climate justice, not just at the UN level, but also at the country level. There are a small number of faith-based organizations that are driving the advocacy efforts of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative in their national context and community context. The United Nations Environment Assembly is an opportunity every 2 years for civil society to come and meet with member states at the highest level of environmental governance and policy. Faith-based organizations can pursue the mode of accreditation to participate, to be official observers of this process. But more importantly, look at this as a responsibility and an opportunity to push the envelope, to move ambition of member states by coming together, networking amongst the accredited organizations that are 90 plus at the moment, and advocate for the type of policy that you would like to see and implement in your organizational, country level, grassroots setting.
Our next guest is Hector Poveda. He works at the International Catholic Migration Commission, where he supports civil society organizations, including migrant groups, faith-based networks, trade unions, and human rights collectives, in participating in global discussions at the intersection of migration and displacement. Originally from Colombia, Hector has lived and studied in various countries and possesses degrees in philosophy, politics, economics, and anthropology. How do faith-based organizations like ICMC define their role in international climate negotiations?
Thank you so much for having me here. For us as a faith-based organization, the role is in international climate negotiations goes beyond technical, but it is rather a deeply spiritual and ethical. We carry a moral imperative out of our faith traditions, particularly through frameworks like the Laudato Si, call us to care for our common home and ensure that those most affected by climate change, such as migrants and indigenous peoples and local communities, are not left behind in political decision making. At ICMC, we also try to create a space for grassroots voices within global processes. That's something we've done, for instance, through the Civil Society Action Committee and the Civil Society Mechanism for the Global Forum on Migration and Development. Our job is to ensure that justice, inclusion, and dignity guide conversations, and that our partner organizations play a key role in climate negotiations and migration governance processes, as well as collaborating with other faith-based organizations such as Caritas Internationalis, which is one of the leading faith-based organizations in the climate space. Civic space shrinks and anti-migrant rhetoric intensifies. Truth and migrant-led organizations, as well as faith-based organizations, face growing barriers to meaningful participation in global governance processes. When lived experience is sidelined, governance fails, sources miss the mark, and the gap between policy and the reality widens. Here at ICMC, we work very hard to close that gap, but it's not something that we do just by ourselves, but it's a process of collaboration. So us as ICMC, we define a role in international climate negotiations as connectors. We hope to be able to connect and provide a voice, empower those from the grassroots, those that are working on the ground to participate in these international migration processes. The biggest challenge is structural. The spaces are not built with us in mind. Civil society and within it, faith-based organizations are often included symbolically, but not meaningfully. Unless, of course, conversations are led by our own civil society or the same faith-based organizations, but this tends to be smaller when compared to the other processes like the COPs. There is also tension between short-term political cycles and the long-term visions that we as faith actors bring to the table. Our language, speaking of values like solidarity, stewardship, and dignity, can sometimes feel out of step with how decisions are being made behind closed doors, especially now in a world that is becoming more hostile to migrants and refugees, and where climate denial and negative narratives are unfortunately prominent. But again, we are here to remind governments and institutions that climate change is not only about emissions, but it's about people, displacement, hunger, forced migration, and the breakdown of ecosystems. It is also about the losses we cannot put a price on, and the spiritual and cultural violence that, of course, when communities are uprooted from sacred lands. So why do I say this when asking about the main challenges? The people on the ground is to be heard when engaging in these climate processes, but also it's about access and resources. So many faith-based organizations are being pushed out of international spaces following this year funding cuts by several donor governments. Many of these organizations are struggling to keep the doors open, let alone appear in policy rooms or participate in international migration processes or events like the COP30. These cuts mean fewer meals distributed, fewer access to services, clinics being closed, and people left without support and assistance. So when we are deciding whether assist people from that are on the move on the ground locally and participate policy events like the COP, the decision will always go back to the grassroots because it's the impact, is access, is being able to be there. And with governments take civil society and faith-based organizations more symbolic, as I mentioned during the previous question, you have to decide, and it's a decision that oftentimes is made for you. In all of this, we always try to hold a space for hope. Hope is a very powerful and a special sentiment that we hope that more organizations could hold on to. The work is very hard, and the political terrain is not always in our favor. But the alliances we build across faiths, with secular actors, and most importantly, with communities who continue to resist, stand up for these injustices and this change, is what keeps us going. Through the Action Committee and the civil society mechanism, we try to continue building these alliances, as well as the other work that the ICMC does broader. We try to keep these alliances and to keep on holding on that hope. Because despite of how many battles we fight, despite how many challenges it comes our way, all of us working on this space always remain to that hope. And that's what allows us to work late nights and night shifts, and to perhaps cry and go back to work, because it's of the hope that we're able to make a change and to be able to empower those on the ground. And when it comes to these policy spaces like the COP, like the GFMD, the GCM, we don't show up because we think we have all the answers, that we would love to. But sometimes that's not the case. We show up because we believe that another way is possible, a way where human dignity, the protection of a common home, and the rights of people of the move and people that have been marginalized and are on the margins are not optional but central to how decisions are made, where lived realities, especially those affected by climate mobilities and immobilities, are the ones driving policy and driving change, that they're not left symbolically, but they're actually the actors driving the conversations, where governments, decision makers, policymakers are actually listening to them and driving the conversation forward, so that the resources are not lost, so that people, the traditions, the culture, the lives are not lost, because every loss is an impact. Damage is an impact, and it's something that in many cases, when we, for example, talk about the impacts of climate mobilities in loss and damage, in non-economic loss and damages, there are things that we can't get back, things that don't have a price, things that we should be talking more about. So this is important, where those lived realities are the ones driving changes.
Our last guest is Pierre Martinot-Lagarde. He is the Special Advisor for Social Religious Affairs at the International Labour Organization, where he builds partnerships with faith-based groups, governments, and NGOs to tackle labor and social issues. He spearheads the Future of Work, Labor After Laudato Si, a project linking the changing world of work with the environmental and social teachings of the Laudato Si encyclical. Before joining the ILO in 2008, Pierre was the director of SERAS in Paris and spent many years as a Jesuit until early 2024. Today, we explore his unique journey and his work at the crossroads of faith, labor, and sustainability. Pierre, thank you so much for joining us on the Faith and Ecology podcast. How does your work, specifically linking faith-based organizations with the principles of the Laudato Si within the labor and climate change, influence climate policies?
It's a pleasure to be there. And I think the climate road over the last 10 years, with the whole difficulties which have arisen one after the other, it can be read now as a sort of warning of where we are. What do we expect from faith leaders and faith-based organizations? First is leadership. When Pope Francis spoke at the UN, it was a very acclaimed message, very inspiring. And this is the second thing that we expect in the multilateral system, to find inspiration from faith leaders. Not much. The last one is commitment and motivation. The second part of the story, which goes with inspiration and the difficulty, is the fragmented areas. And we have a global decision-making process at the global level as much as the national level. You have people who are dealing with the financial part, with the normative part, with health. You have the people dealing with work. And this tends to be fragmented at the global level. One of the difficulties there is that how to articulate the work issue into the climate change issue. And that's where it comes. So how do we connect those two? And the specific narrative of faith-based organization is that they are holistic in nature. So we cannot isolate work from the rest of our life. We spend 8 hours, the best 10 hours sometimes working. I think the real value of Laudato Si was to bring at the center the notion of care, caring for a common whole. So usually work, we understand it in the dynamic of creation. It's a very transformative look at nature. We work to transform nature. But what if instead of working to transform nature, we would be working to care for nature? This has very sound implications. First, in the way we understand and reflect on our work. Understanding in the broad sense of integral human ecology is that caring for our home is not just caring from nature as an object around us, it's also caring for our societies, our communities, and so on. The second implication on that is that the workers become part of the stories. And mean the workers, you are workers, I'm worker, we are workers. And so we tend sometimes to reflect on the climate debates as basically a story between business and consumers. Consumers, if we look at the communities, we had many projects about church being green, and that means, being energy efficient and so on. That's fine, but that's a restrictive approach. But what about us looking together, not only as providing, but as looking at an approach where we would discern together as communities, as people? We've been looking at as basically these two things. First, starting from care and a new idea and saying what it is it if we mean that care, work is about caring. And second, what does it mean if we are looking at a journey? So we call it a common social discernment approach. And common means that we are talking together. That is the two things. An anthropological foundation, and second, a common journey. What we meant at this end is that doing that is exactly building what we could call global transformative communities. It means that communities are at the center, but they cannot just be local. Otherwise, we go back to the not in my backyard approach.
Thank you for joining us as we explored how faith-based organizations work at the intersection of climate negotiations. Thank you to Azmaira, Pierre, and Hector for bringing us crucial perspective on how climate negotiations are shaped by the faith sector beyond COP30. Their work shows how this vital role is driving justice and solidarity on the global stage. As Pope Francis reminds us in Laudato Si, the climate is a common good, belonging to all and meant for all. Let this call inspire us to work together for a just and sustainable future. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we will be discussing the powerful concept of climate debt justice and the profound role that the faith community is playing in advocating for economic justice at COP30. I'll see you then.